The last thing retired Marine Staff Sergeant Thomas Ellison expected was trouble. He'd driven 6 hours from Baton Rouge to see his daughter walk across the graduation stage, something he'd promised her years ago, back when she still wore pigtails and called him Daddy instead of Dad. The gym at Greenville Central buzzed with laughter, squeaking shoes, and the low hum of folding chairs on hardwood. Balloons bounced. Grandmothers waved programs like fans. Everything was perfect until it wasn't. 2 security guards, young and stone-faced, spotted Thomas sitting quietly in the front section and made their way toward him. He wasn't loud. He wasn't out of place. But something about him, a black man in full Marine dress blues sitting alone, seemed to trigger the wrong kind of attention. What came next didn't involve raised voices or thrown fists, just a quiet refusal. A veteran who had endured war zones wasn't about to be moved by a rented badge and a sideways glance. And as tension filled the gym, 6 men scattered throughout the crowd stood up. Not to speak, not to threaten, but to remind everyone watching that silence can still shake a room. Thomas Ellison never liked being the center of attention. Even in uniform, he carried himself like a man who didn't need to remind anyone of where he'd been. 47 years old, with shoulders shaped by both war and fatherhood, Thomas had seen enough to know that most people only look twice when they're unsure where to place you. He parked his black Dodge Charger near the back lot of Greenville Central, far from the crowd of SUVs and family vans. The sun was already high, casting long shadows across the pavement as he stepped out, smoothing the crisp lines of his dress blues. His boots were shined to a quiet mirror, not for show, but because that's how he did everything. His daughter Kira was graduating, and no way in the world was he going to miss it. He reached into the glove box and pulled out a photo, his wife holding Kira as a newborn, both of them beaming. His late wife had passed 4 years earlier, and this photo never left his side. He tucked it into the inside pocket of his coat, close to his heart, then adjusted his cap and started toward the building. The gym was already filling up, families waving, cameras flashing, teachers guiding people to their seats. Thomas moved through it all with the quiet ease of someone who had learned to carry weight without complaint. He wasn't here to make noise. He was here to witness something his daughter would remember for the rest of her life. The 2 security guards stood just inside the gym doors, scanning the crowd like they were waiting for something to go wrong. One was broad and buzz-cut, arms folded too tight across his chest. The other, leaner and restless, kept shifting from foot to foot, chewing gum like it owed him money. Neither looked older than 30. When Thomas showed his printed ticket to a school volunteer and was directed to the front family section, neither guard said a word. But a few minutes after he sat down, they approached with forced calm and unreadable expressions. "Excuse me, sir," the stockier one said. "This section's reserved." Thomas met the man's eyes, unshaken, and handed him the same ticket he had just shown at the door. The guard barely glanced at it. "We've been told this row already at capacity. We're going to have to ask you to move." Thomas's voice was calm. "This is the seat I was given." The taller guard stepped in, trying to sound casual but falling short. "There's space in the back. No big deal." But it was. It was the way they said it, the way they loomed just a little too close, the way they looked at him without really seeing him. Around them, a few heads began to turn. Thomas didn't move. He'd dealt with worse than this. Men with weapons, not walkie-talkies. And while the guards saw a man alone, what they didn't realize was that he hadn't walked into that gym by himself. Thomas didn't flinch. His body stayed still, legs planted, eyes forward like the guards weren't even there. He wasn't being defiant. He was being deliberate. The shorter guard's voice tightened. "Sir, don't make this into a situation." Thomas turned slowly, his voice low. "You already did." A ripple moved through the nearby rows. A father leaned toward his wife, whispering. A teenager angled her phone without looking obvious. On stage, faculty members glanced nervously toward the disturbance, pretending not to see what everyone was now watching. "Just come with us, please," the taller guard said, trying to keep his voice down. But it was too late. The energy in the gym had shifted. From the corner of the room, a man in a tan blazer stood up, not loud, not fast, just steady. Then another across the aisle, then two more near the bleachers. No words were spoken, no signals exchanged. They weren't together in the traditional sense, but they moved like men who'd shared danger before. 6 in total, silent, still, watching. The guards didn't know who they were, but Thomas did, and in that moment, without a word, the room understood something real was happening. The weight of it spread like a hush before thunder. Thomas didn't need to stand. He didn't need to explain. His silence was no longer solitary. It had backup, the kind that didn't need permission to step forward. And suddenly, what started as 2 guards flexing authority became something much bigger. No one dared speak, but no one looked away. Every eye in that gym knew instinctively this wasn't about policy anymore. This was about respect, or the lack of it, and the quiet storm that comes when you push a man who spent his life learning how not to be pushed. The taller guard stepped in again, closer this time, his tone more clipped. "Sir, if you don't come with us now, we'll have no choice but to remove you." Thomas didn't blink. He kept his gaze locked forward, hands resting calmly on his thighs, voice even. "You're out of line." The shorter guard's jaw twitched. "This is your last warning." And that's when the air inside the gym changed. One of the men who had stood earlier took a step into the aisle, folding his arms across his chest without a word. Another adjusted his stance near the exit doors, not aggressive, just ready. Thomas didn't need to look. He knew the rhythm of their movements, the quiet choreography of men trained to read a room and anchor it with nothing more than their presence. The guard noticed them too. He glanced sideways, suddenly unsure. "You bringing people into this now?" he asked, voice sharp with frustration. Thomas finally turned his head, slowly. "They're not here for you. They're here for the moment." The guard tried to smirk, but it didn't land. He was feeling it now, the pressure of eyes on him, the awareness that this wasn't going the way he'd expected. "Look," he muttered. "We don't want this to get ugly." Thomas met his eyes, voice steady as steel. "Then walk away." The silence that followed felt like a held breath. Someone coughed in the back row. A teacher froze in mid-step. From the bleachers, an older veteran in a denim jacket stood and quietly removed his cap. One of the Marines near the side wall tapped his boot once against the gym floor. It was subtle, intentional, a warning without volume. Thomas remained seated, grounded, but the message had already been delivered. This wasn't a man to be intimidated. This wasn't a crowd to be underestimated. The guards had mistaken stillness for submission, and now they were realizing the room wasn't theirs to control. Not anymore. Not with men like this watching. Not with history sitting quietly in the front row, refusing to be erased. The push had come, and the pushback had already begun. Kira Ellison stood 3 rows back in her graduation line, her cap tilted slightly from all the nervous adjusting. She had been smiling seconds ago, whispering with her best friend about who might trip on stage. But when she caught sight of the 2 guards hovering near her father, the color drained from her face. She knew that look, his spine straight, jaw firm, not moving a muscle even as someone stood over him. It was the same look he wore when the insurance company gave them the runaround after her mom's funeral, when the neighbor called him "sir" with too much sarcasm and not enough respect. That wasn't her dad getting ready to fight. That was her dad deciding not to. And that, she knew, was even more dangerous. Her breath caught as she noticed the men rising from the crowd. Not fast, not dramatic, just steady. One leaned against a wall with arms crossed. Another folded his hands in front of him like he was guarding a gate. They didn't speak. They didn't look at each other. But something about how they moved told her they weren't strangers. She didn't know who they were, but her gut whispered that they knew her dad. Not from church, not from work, from something deeper, something earned in silence. She scanned the crowd for a familiar face, but the room had gone still. Even the announcer on stage stumbled slightly over the next name. Kira clutched her program tight, her heart thudding in her chest. She didn't know what was about to happen, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about a seat. This was about something no rule book could explain. And her father, sitting alone in that folding chair, wasn't alone at all. Something bigger was unfolding. Something she would remember long after the diploma left her hands. The shorter guard's hand dropped near his radio, not touching it, but just close enough to change the mood in the entire gym. That subtle movement sent a jolt through the space, small but sharp, like the click before a trigger. Thomas didn't move, didn't flinch. He just lifted his eyes, slowly, and met the man's stare. "Think carefully," he said, his voice low and even. Before the guard could answer, a new voice cut across the stillness, calm, firm, deliberate. "Is there a reason this man is being bothered?" It came from a man standing near the center aisle, tall, broad, clean-shaven, dressed in a dark gray jacket that hung like it had seen a battlefield. His name wasn't spoken, but the tone said everything. The guards looked up, surprised. The taller one stepped forward. "Sir, this is a security matter." The man didn't blink. "Then you're handling it poorly." Another Marine rose from the back of the bleachers. Then two more. They stood in different parts of the gym, like sentinels, quiet and still. No signals, no orders, just presence. The principal, seated on stage, noticed the shift and whispered something to an assistant. A wave of uncertainty rippled through the faculty. They didn't know what was happening, but they could feel it. Everyone could. The gym was no longer just a ceremony space. It had turned into a proving ground. One more wrong word, one more twitch toward that radio, and the whole room would erupt, not in chaos, but in righteous stillness. The man in the gray coat took a step forward. "You need to walk away," he said to the guards, not with menace, but with finality. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, charged, respectful. The guards stood frozen, caught between protocol and something bigger than policy, something they didn't understand but suddenly feared. Thomas hadn't risen, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't moved, but 6 Marines had, and they weren't asking. They were reminding. This wasn't about a seat. It was about a man, a father, a leader. And in front of a room full of strangers, what was almost a quiet dismissal had become a reckoning. The principal finally moved from the stage, heels clicking quickly across the gym floor as she whispered urgently into the taller guard's ear. His jaw clenched, eyes scanning the room now filled with tension so thick you could almost hear it hum. Whatever she said, it landed. His posture shifted, shoulders slackening just enough to reveal uncertainty. The shorter guard wasn't ready to let go. His pride, like a fuse already lit, burned too close to the end. He stepped forward one last time, eyes locked on Thomas. "This is your last chance," he said, voice louder now, cracking slightly under pressure. "Don't make this worse for yourself." But that's when the Marine in the gray jacket took another step forward, slow and calm, and said, "You've already done that." Around the gym, people were no longer pretending to look away. Phones were out. A mother 2 rows up had tears in her eyes, whispering to her daughter, "This is why we teach respect." Kira clutched her program so hard it crumpled in her hands. From the bleachers, another Marine rose, older, weathered, wearing a bull cap embroidered with 2 words, Semper Fi. No speech, just a nod. It was more than enough. The tension reached its edge. The guards were now surrounded not just by men who knew war, but by the weight of something they couldn't fight. Dignity, brotherhood, witness. The shorter guard's hand hovered again. But before he could act, Thomas finally spoke, softly, clearly. Don't confuse silence with surrender. That line didn't echo through the gym because of its volume. It hit because of its truth. The shorter guard froze. The taller one stepped back. And just like that, the threat collapsed under the weight of what it had provoked. The moment cracked wide open. It was no longer about control. It was about exposure. The crowd wasn't just watching. They were remembering. And from that second on, there was no walking it back. The power had shifted. And for the first time that day, the guards realized they were the ones outnumbered. Not in muscle, but in meaning. The reversal didn't need force. It had already happened the moment Thomas refused to stand. Kira's name was announced with a slight pause, like the speaker understood the weight in the room and didn't want to rush it. Kira Simone Ellison. The sound carried through the gym like a spotlight, landing on the girl who'd held her breath through 10 long minutes of tension and pride. The crowd erupted, but not in the usual scattered claps and polite cheers. This was different, louder, sharper, rising like a wave from every side of the bleachers. And then came the most powerful moment of all. The 6 Marines who had been standing silently, scattered throughout the crowd, lifted their hands in perfect rhythm and began to applaud. Not fast, not performative, just strong, steady, and unified. A tribute without words, a salute without salute. Kira walked the stage slowly, head high, eyes searching the audience until they found him. Her father hadn't moved from his chair. He didn't rise. He didn't clap. He didn't need to. He gave her a small, proud smile, so calm it almost broke her. That smile said everything. She stepped down with her diploma in hand, every ounce of fear replaced with something permanent. At that moment, the gym wasn't a place for a ceremony. It had become a witness, not just to a graduation, but to character, to what it looks like when respect stands taller than uniforms, louder than commands. The reversal didn't happen with shouts. It happened when the truth stepped into the light and refused to move. And now nobody in that gym would forget what they saw. Outside, the gym doors swung open and spilled the crowd into the sunlight. But the weight of what had just happened didn't disappear. Parents gathered in tight circles, whispering about the man in the front row and the 6 who stood with him. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others nodded in quiet approval. The 2 guards were nowhere to be seen, escorted out a side door minutes before the final name was called. The principal gave a short statement to a local reporter, calling it a misunderstanding, but nobody was buying it. Phones had captured everything. So had hearts. What people would remember wasn't who got the loudest cheer or the biggest bouquet. It was the moment silence became power. Kira stood near the flagpole, holding her diploma like it weighed more than paper. Her father walked up beside her, no words at first, just presence. She looked at him, eyes burning with questions and pride. "You okay?" he asked. "Yeah," she said. "They tried to move you." He nodded. "And you didn't let it steal your moment." Around them, the 6 Marines gathered in a loose circle. No one posed for pictures. No one gave speeches. They just watched, made sure everything stayed steady. A teacher passed by, pausing long enough to say, "That was something," then kept walking. Nobody needed to explain it. Justice didn't come with headlines or press releases that day. It came quietly when a man chose to stay seated, and the world finally saw why. The Charger sat warm under the Louisiana sun, its engine ticking softly as it cooled. Inside, Thomas and Kira sat in silence, both staring out the windshield but lost in separate thoughts. Kira finally broke the quiet, her voice soft. "Why didn't you say anything? You just sat there." Thomas rested his hands on the steering wheel, then looked over at her. Because I didn't need to. I know who I am. I know what I've earned. Some things don't need defending. They speak for themselves. She nodded slowly, but her brows still pulled together. But they disrespected you. Thomas gave a small, tired smile. They did. And everyone saw it. But they also saw what happened next. That's what matters. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the folded photo, the one of her as a baby in her mother's arms. This has been with me in every war zone, every base, every hard moment. Because this is what I protect. Not a seat, not a reputation. You. Kira held the photo gently, her eyes welling up. I almost walked off that stage, she whispered. Thomas turned to her, firm and proud. And that's exactly why you didn't. Because you held your ground, just like I did. For a few beats, neither said a word. Then, from across the parking lot, one of the Marines raised a hand, not a wave, just a gesture of respect. Thomas nodded back. The sun kept climbing, but for them, time had paused, long enough to remember what strength really looks like. Some moments don't need headlines or hashtags to matter. They unfold quietly, without grand speeches or spotlight drama. What happened that day wasn't just about a seat at a graduation. It was about presence, dignity, and the power of standing firm without raising your voice. Thomas didn't challenge authority with fists or fury. He challenged it with stillness, the kind that only comes from living a life grounded in purpose. And when 6 Marines stood with him, without being asked, the entire room learned something that can't be taught in textbooks. True strength doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand permission. It shows up silently when it's needed most. Kira's diploma wasn't the only thing earned that day. So was respect, the kind that stays with you long after the applause fades. If this story reminded you of someone who carries themselves with quiet strength, share it with them. Let them know they're seen. Because in a world full of noise, the people who choose to lead with honor, calm, and resolve are the ones who leave the deepest echo. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be moved.